uh, give it a few minutes here. Looks like people are pouring in. Welcome, everybody. Welcome, welcome. All right. My name is Jeff Brogger, Director of Marketing at Spring Labs. Here we also have John, Paul, and Johnny. You guys want to introduce yourselves? John first.
Yeah, absolutely. John Sun, co-founder and CEO at Spring Labs. Excited to be sharing some of our cool AI updates with everyone. But my background was in financial services, basically my whole career. And before Spring Labs, I started a number of fintech and PFM and lending companies.
Awesome. And Paul?
Paul Zhang, CIO and co-founder at Avant. I have also been in fintech my whole career, PFM, lending, etc. Excited to talk about AI with everyone here.
Awesome. Johnny?
Johnny Reinsch, co-founder and CEO of Tradable. And I started my career as an M&A lawyer. I left after doing about $20 billion worth of technology and private equity deals to join a crypto startup called Zappo. I built and ran their institutional business to over 1 million BTC under our custody. Before that, sold to Coinbase. I then ran a payments and lending platform called Quill. And after selling Quill, I'm now with Tradable.
Excellent. Well, we appreciate all of you taking the time today to talk about this topic. Generative AI has really taken off in the last year or two. And at Spring, we're very excited to talk about how Avant is looking to AI to deflect 15% of customer service calls and also improve customer experience. And that's really the narrative of this particular webinar, is the focus on improving customer experience. So very excited to host this conversation. And I think it's about a good time to dive in. Looks like the room's at about a critical mass, so let's keep going here. So real quick disclaimer, of course, we're going to breeze by this, but have to show it. Of course, this is a webinar. It's for training purposes, and that is that. Housekeeping. Yes, this is being recorded, so no worries. It's being recorded. If you registered, we'll send it to you. And we can also send the slides, no problem. Also, there is a Q&A function. So instead of typing questions into the chat that gets lost, please use the Q&A function. We will have a question and answer session at the end, and we will then answer those that were in the Q&A tab. So Avant, you've always been a leader, Paul, in new technology adoption and, around data science, machine learning, AI. I'm curious, what was Avant's first experience kind of using technology to help get an edge in this space?
Well, I think from the very beginning, that was kind of our thesis when we started Avant, right? Digital only consumer lending from a customer experience perspective, and then using data science, AI, and ML to make better lending decisions. And so from the very beginning, we were, digital only. So all customer applications, servicing, all of our customer interaction was through digital channels. And then on the risk side, right, we were one of the first institutions out there to really use machine learning to segment credit risk, right? So we started using random forests, gradient boosting machines, et cetera. And so we were way back in 2012, 2013, one of the first ones to kind of explore using those techniques to segment risk. And I'm happy to say that we are still one of the market leaders in terms of being able to accurately price risk using kind of continuation of those types of models. And I'm excited to kind of look at how generative AI can help augment that in terms of providing a delightful customer experience,
Yeah, absolutely. And generative AI, what are your short and long-term focus areas to adopt Gen AI and use it moving forward with Avant?
So I think there's a few different areas. I think if you think about generative AI, it's a lot of, there's two main things, right? There's large language models, there's image generation, et cetera, right? And so large language models are really, really good at analyzing and generating text, right? And so we're exploring ways to use that for that purpose, right? So some of those use cases could be something in compliance, something with answering customer questions, et cetera, but also maybe exploring how to use that to analyze fraud or anything that where you're generating a lot of like a corpus of text and you're trying to really make a determination and then kind of like use that LLM's intelligence to help make things more efficient or a better customer experience for our customers. And so so I'm happy to talk about here today is kind of like how we're using Gen AI to make a better customer experience through really providing better support for our customers, right? Through chat and potentially further down the line using it, expanding the use case.
Yeah, I mean, with customer interactions, there's so much data, and one of the strengths of Gen AI has always been recognized as structuring unstructured data. So I was talking about chat. I noticed that there's no chat function on Avant's website now. Can you talk a little bit about why you went away from the digital trend, especially, but also the industry trend of having a chat function on your site?
Yeah, we just found that traditional customer service chat didn't really move the needle for us. So we were still providing kind of like the best customer experience through phone support, and that's where the majority of our customers preferred as well. And it wasn't great for us from an operational perspective, and it wasn't great for us from a customer experience perspective, right? And so we decided to focus really on providing like best-in-class phone support, and that's kind of where our mentality has been the last few years. We used to have chat. We kind of removed it after seeing mixed results, and that's where I think it's an exciting time, right? Because we believe that with the help of generative AI technologies, maybe that can help create a better chat experience and really a better customer experience overall for us.
Yeah, and the focus is really on the customer experience. And Johnny, I'm curious, do you have a chat function on Tradable as well?
No, we don't. We don't use chat. Most of the customers that we're supporting are used to being in an email inbox, and so we field frontline through just a support inbox. And then, typically, given the nature of our customers, they're like institutional asset managers or family offices, those types. It's very white glove. So somebody will typically call them back and make sure that the issue's been resolved. So there's definitely some opportunity there for us that we see with at least triaging to the first best response and leveraging things like AI to get you there. We're still kind of figuring out based on the user type that we serve, what level of familiarity that they'll have with something like that. So, but ultimately getting people to the right answer as quickly as possible is our goal.
Yeah, and it's actually kind of interesting that you guys don't currently use chat, but I mean, obviously, I think Avant has explored it before, and there's good reasons why not. Because Paul, the first thing we did when we had started working together was to do an analysis of why customers were emailing or why customers are calling into your call centers. And I think there's potentially a lot of value there. Would love to kind of hear what you thought of the analysis, and ultimately, what did we find when we analyzed that conversation data?
Yeah, I think like when we first looked at kind of like inbound emails and like the tasks to do, you're looking at kind of like roughly half of kind of the tasks to do were effectively self-serviceable, right? Like you could like potentially like those were things that whether through through self-service or a combination of like human assisted and self-service that like are the customer can achieve themselves. And sometimes it was kind of like a question of customer experience, right? Like it's like the customer didn't know how to self-service or didn't feel comfortable or didn't have the right channel to self-service, right? And part of like how I think about Gen AI is it's really like a lot of times I feel like the conversation, or especially around operations, is how do we kind of like automate away like what the call center does or like what the operations team does. But I think that really is opening a can of worms, because like those are very discrete processes that you kind of have to like understand the entire business process in order to kind of like automate. It's more around kind of like, how do you make these tasks to do, like these things to be done by our customer, like better, right? Like how do you make, or like more self-serviceable, a better customer experience? And naturally that will decrease the load that your operations team will have to take on, because you're designing a better, more delightful customer experience for your customers. And Gen AI is just one of those tools, right? And so like, I think like that's the right way to think about it. It's like, how do you enable these self-service tasks to be delightful and to be kind of like something that people want to self-service through the usage of your tools, of which now Gen AI is one of the most prominent ones.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy that over half of incoming customer service requests could be filled by functionality that already exists on your website, or functionality that the customer has direct access to through the web app or the mobile app, or information they have access to through the application. But I can't imagine this is news to you guys. You probably have known about this for quite a while. So why the change of heart now? When we first started speaking together, I remember trying to kind of convince you to try the customer assist AI, for quite a while. Ultimately, what got you over the hump for giving it a shot?
Well, I think it's kind of like any good like startup co-founder. I think like there is a kernel of like, hey, let's iterate, let's try, let's do like kind of like, let's try to like build like a thesis and then test it, right? But also at the same time, you kind of like as everyone and learns more about generative AI, there's more and more excitement around kind of like the possibility of really asymmetrically addressing customer need, right? There is, a lot of things that like a generative AI model can kind of help you do that exists out of traditional chat models or support models. And so I think, like it's one of those things where you can see kind of the leverage that it can potentially give you as a business, and it would be foolish not to explore what that possibility means, and whether you can build like a better customer experience just through that usage, and be able to really like at the end of the day help your customers lives be more efficient, be better, right?
Yeah, no, totally makes sense. But the question I always ask, and I know we talked about this before, it's like, how do you measure success? That's like my big thing with all of these engagements, because obviously we want to make sure we're kind of delivering a successful kind of experience as well. Like, what are you guys looking to achieve with this, and what are the metrics that are success indicators?
Well, I think success indicators, obviously we measure customer NPS, right? Like pretty consistently. We look at our ratings across multiple review sites. What we want to do is improve that, right? Like ultimately to give our customers a better customer experience. But at the same time, we want to improve kind of like self-service, right? So part of that is you look at it from two perspectives, right? So we have a measure of like number of things that customers do through our self-service tools, right? So everything in our self-service is powered by something called a workflow, and we keep track of like how much customers engage with our workflows, right? So ideally, we want to see that improve as customers enter more of the self-service flow. And at the same time, on a corollary basis, you would want to see kind of like overall decrease in load for our operations staff, right? And kind of like help them not have to answer as many of these inquiries that are potentially self-serviceable. And so those are kind of like go hand in hand, right? Like we would want to see our customers self-service, but at the same time, we want to see that the level of, or like the level of customer delight in our customer experience is still at the same level or even higher.
Right. Yeah. And speaking of self-service, this is anecdotal, but I prefer self-service, and I've talked to family members about what I'm doing at Spring Labs and empowering financial institutions with technology, and they've commented that they prefer self-service. Do you have any data around that? Did you survey users? I'm curious, just a off the top question about the preference of self-service from a customer standpoint.
I do. I know we have done surveys. I don't know off the top of my head. I know that it is what you would traditionally assume. So like younger cohorts of customers typically want to self-service. And as like we are digital only, like there's a large cohort of folks on our end who want to self-service, right? And so it really is about trying to bring the best product for meeting your customers where they want to be, right? Like, so bringing kind of like all the different avenues of customer touch to the customer so that they can choose the best avenue to kind of engage with your product.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. And we'll potentially follow up with a data study to support that and release it as a blog post or something. But yeah, it's definitely my feeling. And Johnny, I'm curious, have you seen something similar where empowering users with self-service yields an increase in NPS score?
For sure. I mean, I think making a workflow that someone is going to have to do anyways a little more apparent and a little more delightful, whether it's breadcrumbing in the app in the right way or supporting blog posts or whatever. I definitely see positive correlation with increase in customer happiness through that stuff. So if you can empower your customers to do the thing that they want, 99% of the time they're going to want to do it. And then every now and then there, you do have a customer that just wants to be heard, and that's fine too. Get on the phone with them, make them feel special.
Right. I think the great part about these new technologies is that when that customer does come through that does want to be heard, your customer service teams have been alleviated from a lot of the work that they used to previously help, which is now handled by self-service. And so they now have more bandwidth and time to spend that extra time with that customer that needs it.
Definitely. I was curious about how like the impact of what you just mentioned on the actual customer support team and like preventing burnout and ultimately helping them be happier when they get on the phone or they're serving a customer because they're not handling paper cuts of tasks of things that just happen over and over and over again. I would imagine there's a big boost there. Paul or John, have you guys seen that?
I mean, I think like we haven't done like any sort of empirical study on that, but I would agree that like there is something to be said about kind of like providing a more kind of like delightful experience to your employees as well, right? Because ultimately, folks want to do work that is meaningful and kind of like satisfying, right? And like to your point, right? Like if you're like resetting passwords for customers all day, every day, that you're helping someone, but ultimately, like that's that can get repetitive, right? Ultimately. And so providing, and also it's not a great customer experience because there's a lag, right? Like you're kind of like, you have to call in, you have to talk to someone to reset your password. That's just like, you want to reduce the burden of repetitive tasks on your employees, but at the same time, you want to give customers immediate feedback or immediate like tools to solve their own kind of like problems. Because everyone's lives are busy, right? Like you don't want to wait an hour to kind of like and talk to someone or it may not be an hour, but like, you don't wait like 10 minutes to talk to someone and have to like reset your password. And if you could self-service or figure out how to self-service, right?
Totally. That is interesting. I am interested in that convergence of like the customer is happier and also the employee is happier. And so what impact those two factors both have on increasing NPS or whatever the metrics might be. I wonder if anyone else out in the industry has done anything on that, maybe Gong or someone, but I would imagine intuitively, it seems like everybody would be happy in that scenario.
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely it makes sense to me. I mean, I think that's a large part of the kind of our thesis as well, is how do we free up employees to focus on the parts of their job which they can kind of uniquely add value to. And I think, certainly kind of being able to resolve some of the tougher issues for customers is right along those kind of veins. Not having to do as much, routine, data processing or routine kind of, customer service tasks, and really being able to focus on the places where, again, they can make a difference to their customers or consumers' lives. And Paul, I know kind of we said at the beginning of the webinar, how Avant is looking to deflect up to 15% of customer service calls using AI. So I think, we came up with a set of math here. Like, what did you find in the initial test phase? Were you kind of satisfied with the results here?
Well, I think we're iterating through the kind of like our use case, right? And I think like we're really excited about kind of like what we're seeing with the initial results, and I think like we're very confident in that like we will be able to support a lot of our customers, kind of like, or help our customers answer a lot of the questions that they haven't traditionally been able to self-service. And so we're looking at the 15% number is using this 50% of customer inquiries that are potentially self-serviceable, and then assuming a 30% adoption, we would of chat, we would get to like 15% of kind of like a reduction in inbound requests. And we're really excited with the kind of like test results that we're seeing as we're doing the implementation. And I think we're pretty confident that we'd be able to get to that point. And I think like that's what is exciting about this opportunity is like we see that there is like a potential for a big impact, right? Like not just from a pure deflection perspective, but also through kind of like better customer engagement and the ability to really meet your customer where they want to be and help them with their everyday needs.
Yeah, no, I think all of that makes a ton of sense, and certainly I think you're absolutely right. It's not just about the financial impact. There's a lot more to it. How do you make your customers happier and your and your employees more productive? But if we were to kind of look at the financial impact of this, if kind of these results are kind of achievable and hold up over time, what would that mean from a financial impact perspective for Avant?
Well, I think like you would be looking at kind of like potentially in the kind of like millions of cost savings potentially. But like I mentioned, like it goes beyond that point, right? Like because you have another avenue to engage the customer, like I would be like as we kind of like look at the future of the product or the future of like how we're using it, like we would want to see kind of like, and ideally iterate towards kind of like better like engagement with our customers. So like it potentially like impacts on repayment rates or kind of like customer behavior in terms of spend and kind of like driving like kind of like messaging or engagement that helps kind of like improve our customers' lives, but at the same time also improve some of our business metrics, right? So it's not purely in my view kind of like a cost save exercise, because it's effectively opening up another channel with your customers, and then you're introducing something that is kind of like programmable, right? Like it's something that is that you can iterate against, right? And that's and it's also scalable, right? And so that's what's exciting about this opportunity of using generative AI to kind of like build not only chat but better customer experiences, because now you're introducing like another vector that is like that you can apply the same kind of like startup or software engineering principles against, where you're kind of like iterating against the product, you're measuring the results, you can tweak things, you can rapidly iterate and test, and then that should lead to better results, not just on the cost side, but also on kind of like whatever customer engagement metrics that you might want to measure as a company.
Yeah,
that makes sense, Paul. I mean, like Jeff, go back to the last slide really quick, where there's the list of the different self-serviceable things. I'm just thinking of like application status inquiries and password account and account access, updating personal information, switching on and off auto pay. Like those could all ultimately drive like a ton of ROI. And if Paul, to your point earlier in the conversation, if you're delighting the user while you're taking care of these kind of rudimentary actions, you might actually turn what would otherwise have been an inactive user or who wasn't going to convert into a loan with you guys into, an actual loan or a very happy user. One example that I know of from Tradable, where we did something a little gimmicky, but people loved it. We hooked up our data room to ChatGPT, and essentially you could ask your deal that you were interested in questions about the deal. And typical questions, there's probably like a list of 20 total possible questions you could ask it. But it was the interactivity with the chatbot or with the window that people really enjoyed. Even if the question that they wanted was really readily discoverable, like what is the IRR on this deal, which frankly is just a field that sits within the deal's own UI. People wanted to interact with the chatbot. And even where folks, we did some surveys with folks, institutional asset managers, and even where they didn't ultimately find the response helpful, they still used the thing all the time. And so they were active users, even though they didn't like the responses they were getting all the time, because it was new, it was fun. So yeah, I can definitely see, Paul, how it's not just a 15% reduction in those types of kind of inquiries. It's like there's a much cooler ROI figure back there of like driving a core business metric, driving a customer outcome, driving user engagement and excitement. I definitely agree with that.
Yeah, I mean, I think like if you look at those things, right, there are things that customers want to do when they interact with your website or with your mobile app, et cetera, right? And it's a point for customer engagement, right? And in a lot of circumstances, especially in financial services, right? Like if a customer is trying to change a payment date, that could mean something from like an underlying perspective for their financial situation, or like it's a way where we can engage with the customer at the point of like when they have a need, right? And so I think like that's where there's a lot of excitement around, okay, now it's not just, hey, this is what we're doing on like a chat perspective with Gen AI, right? It's opening up another channel where you're kind of saying like, okay, well, I'm not just providing customer need, but I'm also learning about what this customer is like wants to do when they're coming to your website or mobile app, but also like what's going on in their lives, right? Potentially, because you have all this interaction data that you have with them, and so that's where it can get pretty exciting in terms of like helping people in times of need, or providing them with like better financial services at whatever point they are in their lives.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it's exciting new territory. Thank you for being an early adopter and giving CustomerAssist AI a shot with us. And I'm curious, the early adoption of new technology, usually success is not a straight line. So I'm just curious, were there some challenges, either Paul or John, during this process of working together on this new venture, breaking new ground? Were there some challenges you encountered, and how did you overcome them, if so?
Yeah, I'm happy to kick this one off, Paul. I know you have a lot of opinions on this too, because we have been working on this together for a period of time. I think from the Spring Lab side, we've definitely learned a lot building Gen AI products. So I'm going to show you guys kind of our architecture diagram, what we think building a product Gen AI today is kind of like. So Jeff, if we kind of move to the architecture diagram here. I think a lot of people kind of look at Gen AI products and they think that the LLM does all of the heavy lifting. They're kind of like, well, here's the LLM, it does 80% of the work, and we're going to kind of spruce up some of the edges around it and make it a usable product. And I think it's 100%, 180 degrees the opposite, where you're starting with the LLM as a bit of extra functionality from a technology perspective that you wouldn't have had before. This ability to interact with certain types of conversations and language tasks natively, but it's really the foundation for it. you still have to build a delightful, great product on top of it. Delightful, as Paul kind of says. And, this is basically kind of how we see, LLMs products being kind of built today. Is you're using the LLM as a very foundational piece, but what makes it a great product is really the other 80 or 90% of the work that you're going to put in on top of it, because fundamentally LLMs just aren't sophisticated enough to kind of do all of the heavy lifting yet. And Paul, I don't know if that's kind of been your experience, because I know Avant has done AI exploration outside of what we're doing together. I know AI is kind of a big part of your strategy for your team for 24 and 25. Like, would you say this is kind of an accurate representation of where the state of Gen AI products are today?
I would agree. I think it's like what Gen AI really helps you do is you can get like 80% of the way there really quickly, but then that leaves you like a fat tail of 20% that you have to like optimize against. And I think what we're finding is it really is kind of like paradigm shifting, but at the same time, like there's still like a lot of the same principles about building a product that that applies, right? So if you're addressing like a big bang use case and you get 80% of the way there, that last 20% of the fat tail is still a lot of work to try to get through, right? And a lot of times a product isn't going to be deployable or production ready unless you get through a bunch of that last 20%. And so being able to constrain the use cases and effectively not ask the LLM to do too much, right? Like ultimately that reduces the surface area of where you have to kind of mitigate some of these things around relevance of responses or hallucinations, et cetera, right? Like those types of things are kind of you're able to then kind of look at a narrow use case, and then you're also able to define a very specific UAT test case as well as success criteria, right? Otherwise, you're kind of churning through all of these things, and you're not sure whether what you're deploying is going to be a great customer experience, right? Because it's trying to do too much.
Yeah, and I think this is a great time to prompt some questions, because in financial institutions, I mean, that 20% that you have to continue to build constraints and optimize around is also being regulated by regulatory compliance and all of this, fair lending and all these other aspects of financial institutions and their public-facing communication. So, once again, the Q&A, I see some questions coming in. This is great. If you have questions about anything that's been talked about or about this in particular, or if you just want to share some, fears about implementing generative AI, please, communicate with us, and we'll have about 15 minutes at the end to talk openly about it.
I'm going to pick up this one question that's kind of in chat right now, which I think is pretty relevant to what, Paul and I are kind of talking about. What % would you say the LLM gets you there? So Paul obviously said 80%. This slide makes it seem like 20%. I mean, again, I think we're kind of in agreement on how far LLMs get you. It's really a question of how much work do you think that last 20% is? And there's this old saying in startups that the last 20% is 80% of the work. Yeah, so that's really, I think,
80% is 80% of the work, and the last 20% is 80% of the work as well.
The first 80% is 80% of the work, and the last 20% is 80% of the work. That's exactly right. But jokes aside, there have actually been a lot of studies on the effectiveness of LLMs by themselves. And if you look at the startup space today, one of the kind of biggest categories of startups that really the market's starting to sour on is what's called a ChatGPT wrapper. It's basically something where 80% of the heavy lifting is done by ChatGPT. They're basically taking a input or taking a use case or modifying the prompt a little bit to kind of make it more relevant to what the end goal needs to be for that product, and they're just passing it into ChatGPT and passing you the result back. And generally, ChatGPT wrappers, in our experience playing with ChatGPT, in kind of our experience looking at other products on market, as well as, as we're engaging with market research firms like Gartner, somehow all three data sets have kind of converged on this 65% number, meaning roughly the accuracy rate of a ChatGPT wrapper type use case is roughly about 65% for these types of customer service type use cases. So if you were to say like, hey, I'm just going to lean on the LLM, you're going to be about 65% good answers in like some human eval, outcome. Some use cases, 65% is great. Some use cases is terrible. For financial institutions, 65% is nowhere near acceptable. I think that's why you kind of have to build really on top of it. And at least that's kind of what we've seen. And Paul, Johnny, would love to kind of hear what you guys saw like during your explorations with AI.
Yeah, and I'm curious because most AI vendors are hitting up everyone right now. So I'm sure that Paul, Johnny, you're getting hit up every day with these AI vendors, bold claims, offers. So this ties into my next question. What do you usually look for in qualifying AI vendors?
Well, back to the first part, I'll answer that second, Jeff. I would say that our data, so again, we work with like high-end financial institutions that are very much a don't trust verify crowd. And so where we ultimately found the most benefit for leveraging AI was answer discovery with underlying source links. And if the underlying source was there and it helped somebody answer the question, but then feel good about their answer faster, that was an absolute win. If we came up short of that, then it kind of was unusable in their eyes. And so we had to kind of carve into a use case that was fairly unattainable in that they had to feel 100% confident every single time they were using it. Otherwise, they would not want to use it. And to get there, we ended up using way too much compute. So the ROI ended up not being there, unfortunately. But it was still cool. And I would say that the 65% when we went out of the box with just the wrapper, that's probably about right. The response times were low. The hallucinations were high. And then we started caching. Response times got down to under a second. We started providing more context in the prompt, and things got a lot better. And slowly you whittle it into, something better. But yeah, maybe 65% sounds about right. On your question, Jeff, I think I'm very metrics driven. I get a lot of inbound on AI enabled sales outreach, for instance. And for the most part, when you read the campaigns, when you do any testing with them, they're terrible. If I got this email or if I got this LinkedIn message, there's no way I would respond to this. And I have done some testing with it, and some of the outcomes are actually really good. If you can get beyond the cringe factor of that, I would never say that, or I would, nobody would ever say that. So I think it depends on the context, I guess, is my main point. If you're diligencing an investment on behalf of your SEC registered investment advisor, your uptime needs are way higher than the outbound, strategy for the account executive who, the words matter, obviously, but they aren't going into an IC memo that's going to be reviewed by your investment committee and ultimately come, as part of your annual review. But so along that spectrum, I would say I'm very milestone focused. So what is the ROI that you're going to be able to capture for me? How can we test it? And how can I get comfortable that the testing will be generalizable to when we're in production? And two, what risk am I taking on along the way as well? Low risk, more likelihood to, want to experiment. High risk, way less likelihood to want to experiment.
Got it. That makes sense. Any comments there, Paul?
I think glom on to the last question. I think hyperbolic claims are probably a negative signal, honestly, just because I think having worked in the space, you kind of would you appreciate kind of clear-eyed acknowledgement of of the product development lifecycle even for Gen AI products, right? Because like it's effectively, you know, you're gaining a bunch of efficiency in one area, but at the same time, you know, you have to mitigate some of the things that you normally wouldn't have to worry about if you're writing just like regular code, right? Like if you're looking at hallucinations, you know, like applicability of responses, et cetera. And so I think like, you know, if anyone's really treating this as like a silver bullet, I think that's like, you know, it's probably a negative flag in terms of like, how well do you actually know the ability of Gen AI to apply to any particular area? And I think like, that's where, you know, having kind of like, I've found that the folks that I've talked to who have been more clear-eyed about this process, right? Like, you know, Spring Labs included, have been the ones that have been the most kind of like impressive and knowledgeable, right? Like, you know, payments, really knowledgeable about this area, right? Obviously. And so, yeah, I think I would say that, you know, like hyperbolic, you know, like marketing departments are all about hyperbolic speech, right? Ultimately, like that's how you grab attention. But like, as you dig in and you talk to kind of like, as you talk to the engineering or the product side, et cetera, then like, you know, being able to acknowledge just how like the unknowns in the process and just how fast the industry is changing, right? Like, you know, internally we're a Databricks customer and they're investing heavily into Gen AI as part of their product suite. And just like talking to their team, like, you know, you can see that for such a huge company, they're running really quickly and iteratively, but also kind of like a little bit messily at Gen AI. And so, you know, that's just the nature of the industry right now, I feel like.
I like this question, by the way, of what's an example of a hyperbolic claim? And I feel like the best way to farm these is from whatever the latest YC batch is, trying to sell you like automated outbound sales software. It's like, never field a bad lead again. It's like, what? That's just not true.
Right. Yeah. So let's keep going here because I don't want to get too sidetracked on the questions. That was a great time to bring that one in, but let's hold the questions for the end to make sure to get through this next section. So yeah, with overall experience, you know, Paul, I'm curious, you mentioned some other vendors and Gen AI, working with Spring Labs, of course, through the CustomerAssist AI. You know, what's been your experience working with Spring? You mentioned just a little bit of like payment, data science team, et cetera. Would love for you to just elaborate a little bit while we have the listeners here.
Yeah, I mean, like working with the Spring team on kind of like a couple of different use cases we've iterated quite a bit has been like really good, right? Like, so I think it's like it marries well with kind of like how exciting and exciting the field is, right? There's a lot of changes. We've kind of like had a lot of discussions about like what the product should look like, but also kind of like the underlying technology, right? Because like as we've been working together, you know, like GPT 3.5 and then 4 and then Anthropic, you know, like Mixtral, all of these foundational models have come out. They've been iterated against. Like, you know, it is kind of like there really is a sense of, you know, collaboration, and Spring's very invested in trying to help us solve some of our customer experience and other needs in terms of like building a product together in order to address those questions. So I think like, you know, I would say that like that if I put two words like, you know, on the table, it's responsiveness and responsibility / agility and knowledge, and be knowledgeable about the space, right? Like I think that's more than two words, whatever. But like yeah, it's been a good experience.
In other words, make sure that this isn't what you're buying.
Yes, because you know there's it's very, I mean, it's like it goes hand in hand with folks who are trying to like sell you on a silver bullet, right? Like there is a lot of hair around every single use case, and so you have to kind of like walk into it with like clear eyes.
Yeah,
I mean, I think that's kind of, you know, exactly right. And I think, you know, there's a question here, like, what is the example of hyperbolic claim? this is actually kind of an interesting question, because we're at such the beginnings of like the AI adoption cycle right now that there's necessarily going to be a lot of customization for every single implementation if you want it to work right. So I think the expectation that a product will work out of the box for a specialized, like vertical specific use case is going to be challenging today. And that doesn't mean there's no great out of the box solutions, but I think what you're really looking for is, again, a partner that's willing to iterate with you to kind of get the product to the point that it needs to deliver value to you and to deliver ROI to you as the buyer. And ultimately, ideally, someone that's willing to kind of be, financially incentivized to do that, and to be the one taking the financial risk for making sure that you achieve the ROI and the financial outcomes that's kind of promised. Because as we all know, there's, it's easy to make claims in marketing and sales, as Paul and Johnny have kind of said before, but ultimately, I think look for a partner that's kind of willing to put their money where their mouth is.
Yeah, absolutely. And with that being said, coming from the marketing department, right, we're always writing headlines and attempting to expand the claim. That's what it's called in marketing, right? You take the base data and it's like, how can we work this to where it's still true, but it's like the most sensational aspect of it being true that can catch the most attention. So I think going a layer deeper past the claim, maybe doing some discovery, some vendor research, not committing to a year up front, but just saying like, hey, like we're willing to dig in. And then it was either Johnny or Paul mentioning like, now once you start working with their data science team in a POC or their engineering, you'll be able to see if it's a facade and if it's just a wrapper, or if there's real teeth to this thing that got you interested, right? If they can actually deliver on the claim. So with that being said, want to show a quick 1-minute demo of what this looks like. Probably be valuable for everyone here. So let's do a quick run through and actually look at CustomerAssist AI in action.
Yeah,
So,
and excited to kind of share the demo with everyone here, and this kind of just going to play in the background, and Paul and I will kind of talk through it a bit. But I think the first thing I wanted to kind of point out is that what we set out to build is really kind of what we call a co-pilot experience, a customer co-pilot experience, instead of necessarily a chatbot or a customer service replacement. Like Paul said, there's so much more to the experience than just replacing kind of existing customer service interactions. It's really about how do you create a more delightful experience for customers. And we think the co-pilot model of product functionality reflects what we've done fairly well, which is to give customers the ability to interact with your web application or your mobile application in a more meaningful way, as almost like an agent of the customer rather than kind of agent of the company. And Paul, I know, has some strong thoughts on CX, on the future of kind of CX, and would love to kind of hear if you think we're going the right direction with this product ultimately.
Yeah, I think like effectively, right, like how I look at it is like I mentioned, like it's another vector, right? Like you're effectively like you're investing a lot already as a business into your website or your mobile app, right? And chat should be many things, but one of the things it should be is like a way for customers to use those things more effectively, right? And so part of that is, okay, like you can invest all of these things into making your app, whether web or mobile, more intuitive, et cetera, right? And you should do that. But at the same time, there's going to be a section of the customers that's going to be more comfortable interacting with language, right? With words, right? And so like helping them use your website in of itself should give you a better experience as a customer, right? And then, so that's one area of it that we're trying to address, right? But ultimately, as well as you kind of like open this vector, as you open this like pathway to interact with the customer, then you can layer in additional kind of like interaction points. So it becomes kind of like this ability to kind of like reach your customers. And what we've talked about potentially is like, it does, like, why does chat have to be this like thing on the side of the page, right? Like it's like that's just how traditionally it's always been. But like if you're kind of like confident in your technology's ability to help your customers, maybe it can be more central to the experience, right? Like that's something that we've talked about, and that's something that like is something that you could iterate against and test, right? Like that thesis. So I think that's kind of like how I'm thinking about customer experience is like, you know, like I mentioned, like ultimately chat is just another vector for customer experience. It should ultimately improve your web properties. It should improve the usability of your mobile app or your website. And it really is kind of like a shift from thinking about, okay, this is going to replace my operations center, right? Or like it's really like that's a side effect, right? It's more about kind of like, hey, more and more people are going to find the app more useful, and they'll be able to help themselves through the app because now we have this chat functionality that'll help them as a co-pilot use self-service or answer their questions, et cetera, right? Like that's kind of like the thought process behind that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think if you look at, you know, the first generation of websites, well, how people thought of, you know, websites before is they were a replacement for like magazines, or they were a replacement for some like in-person experience like a branch. And ultimately it was to some extent, but what's interesting is you know, how much more you're able to do with the technology other than what people originally thought it was. And I think, you know, similarly, that's kind of probably where AI is kind of going as well. It's just a matter of kind of developing the collective imagination around AI, especially within financial services, which tends to be a slow adopter kind of industry, to really explore the bounds of like what new customer experiences and what new kind of customer interactions this is enable. So I totally agree with you, Paul.
Yeah, and like the paradigm that we're still in is very much rooted in like how we search web pages. So Avant's page here is beautiful, and everything is kind of structured based on where a user might click a link. But if the interface is chat and AI can be used to essentially make a hierarchical structure obsolete, then you could imagine interacting with a web page or an app in a very, very different way, with or without a UI even. And so I think we're going to see tons of really cool innovation across Web 2 and Web 3, enabled by, you know, AI as a new interface all on its own.
Very excited for kind of the new world here.
Yeah, absolutely.
I know we're down to the last, you know, few minutes here. Let's kind of go through some of the questions that's kind of been posted to chat. So I guess all the panelists can kind of see them. Feel free to kind of grab them.
Yeah, so real quick here, just a little housekeeping. We got about 8 minutes left. Thank you for being here. We're going to answer some questions now and also talk about future of AI. So if you're interested in what you saw today and you'd like to learn more, we actually offer a free demo at Spring Labs. So if you click this link, scan that QR code, you can book a free demo, and then just get into a risk-free POC. You know, we keep it very and like all the risk is on us, right? Like we're willing to prove this concept with you, work with you, be a partner in this, and really explore your use case in depth. And one of the constant pieces of feedback that we get is like, wow, your team really listens and goes deep with us and customizes it for us. So yeah, please scan that code, but we'll be answering some questions here. So let's go ahead and take the next question. Who'd like to go first? You guys see one you want to answer?
So yeah, let's take the first one. This question is from David Peterson. We're working on a Raya-powered chat for our online banking solution. Thank you, David. Great to partner with you on that. The tool works beyond our expectations, but one senior customer service professional is concerned that there is the possibility that using added AI-powered chat could create support calls rather than reduce them. I don't see that this would happen, but curious if there's data that supports that actual call volume for self-service is reduced without generating additional calls regarding the use of AI-powered chat service. Great question. I think this is something that you know isn't the first time that this has come up, certainly, right? And certainly kind of exposing more functionality to customers always has the opportunity to kind of, you know, create customer service questions rather than reduce them. I think, I would agree with your assessment. It's very unlikely this would happen. I think a good parallel to look at is customer chat or customer email channel availability and how that reduces customer service calls. And I think, generally you see both chat and email as kind of channels to deflect from customer service, calls into your call center. Calls obviously being the most expensive channel, followed by email, followed kind of by chat. And I think the reason, especially as we talked through with Avant, with Paul from Avant at the beginning, that some organizations don't offer chat or don't offer email support is not necessarily, because it creates additional customer service phone calls or anything like that, or that it doesn't deflect phone calls, but simply because they determine that the user experience will be better without kind of these tools. But I don't want to, put words in your mouth, Paul. Would love to kind of hear what you think.
So I think like one of the things that I would say, like, this question, the next question actually go kind of like they overlap in certain ways. The next question actually talks about like there's a high regulatory impact for non-compliance, and how do you manage kind of like black box risk, hallucinations, context, et cetera, right? And I think that goes hand in hand with like the risk of generating additional call volume for self-service using an AI tool, right? Because like a lot of kind of like the potential for additional call volume comes from the tool behaving outside of its design boundaries, right? And I think like there's a couple of ways that you can look at it. Just like I mentioned, like it's hard to imagine silver bullet solution kind of like existing. Like if you bite off too much of a scope, right, you are much more likely to generate risk around kind of like nonsensical answers, hallucinations, et cetera, right? And so like constraining and like working with a partner that can help with constraining use cases, just focusing on kind of like, are we answering our design questions, right? Like, are we operating within our product constraints is really helpful in mitigating that risk. But also, I know that, like having worked with Spring, that you guys have like, techniques and tools to kind of help any sort of AI powered solution stay within the boundaries of kind of like acceptable responses, right? And so that's part of every design exercise for AI, right? Because like it's powerful, but at the same time, you have to make sure that it stays on kind of like stays on topic, right? Ultimately, like foundational models are trained on so many different things. They can answer so many different questions, but most of them have no relevance to your use case.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. AI guardrailing, I mean, that's really kind of at the frontier of all of these AI applications. And to your point, Paul, I think the more explicit you can make the use cases, obviously, the more effective your guardrailing is going to be. And in financial services, it's definitely one of these industries where you would rather trade off functionality for consistency and reliability. And I think a good way to do that is by guardrailing the actual use cases and making very explicit what the Copilot or the chatbot is able to answer and what it's not able to answer, what it's able to address and what it's not able to address.
Yeah, I have a great question. Oh, go ahead.
Oh yeah, sorry. Great minds think alike here. I was just going to pick up the next question here. Is the Spring solution developed as repeatable product, or should I view each implementation as primarily custom? This is a great question. So the Spring solution is designed to be a repeatable product, but I will kind of reiterate what I said last time, which is there are almost no off-the-shelf AI products that with no customization is going to deliver you a great experience today. And a lot of that is really kind of because it's a complex problem space, really, to be able to represent your product's functionalities and to help your customers in a way that kind of creates a delightful experience for those customers. I think what AI has done is it made the implementation and customization much simpler. Back in the old days of chatbots, everyone used a process called robotic process automation, or RPA. And what RPA was you basically built this massive decision tree of like, well, if the customer says A, then answer this way, and then go to conversation flow B. It's almost like the old school basic programming, like procedural, like line by line programming of what to do next. And the implementation cycle for that was just horrendous, because there was so many corner cases to kind of take into account, and being able to map out your kind of customers' needs to kind of excruciating levels of detail. And AI generally made that process much easier. And now we use a process that we kind of coined called the intelligent process automation. That basically is AI-powered process automation. And really, that's the foundational technology that we use to kind of develop these implementations. That being said, it still does need to be customized based on your knowledge base articles, based on the assets that the customer has access to. We obviously kind of use a ton of homegrown tools out of the box to help us do that, to be able to kind of crawl through your applications, your web or mobile applications, to understand what the various pieces are, to create as much automation in that implementation process as possible. But there absolutely is kind of still an implementation process that would kind of vary depending on the complexity of the product that we're implementing this Copilot experience into. At a high level, I would say it's about 20 to 30% of the effort of a robotic process automation implementation. So basically, it's anywhere from a 70 to 80% cost or time saving on top of that.
Great answer. And this next one, we'll get to in just a second, but we're at 10 Pacific, so we are at the hour. Obviously, if y'all have to jump, we'll send you the recording. Hopefully the panelists here can stay for just another minute or two, and then we might have to do a round 2 for the future of AI panel discussion. So yeah, it'll be good. We could either stick around after or do a round 2 webinar and do that in a few weeks. So next question here, in the current environment, do you think it's possible to partner with an AI vendor without speaking to the engineering team? I think that's a pretty interesting question.
I think you have to speak to the engineering team. Like it's like just it's not it's such a fast moving space, right? So like even like you want to kind of like get a pulse on who you're working with, and like being able to speak with the engineering team is very like important, at least from my perspective, right? I'm like it's also better for my edification, and so I definitely think so.
I'll counter that with only with it. I view that it depends on the use case, and if something is going to be touching customers from day one and core to your customer experience, I 100% agree with you, Paul. If it's like outbound campaigns or content or things like that where you can rapidly iterate with very low risk, I might speak to the engineering team, but I'm going to more heavily weight the other customer reference that they connect me to, and probably most heavily weight my back channel customer reference for outcomes.
Awesome. Appreciate that. Well, John, Paul, Johnny, do we have 15 more minutes to talk about the future of AI, or do some of you need to jump? We need to do a second round. Okay.
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm at time as well.
Thank you so much for your time. So listeners, we will try to put something on in the next couple of weeks. Look out. If you register for this, then we'll be sending out the recording, the slides, and then future webinar promotions. So hopefully you enjoyed. Of course, if you haven't already, scan that code, get the link in your browser, and start a risk-free trial today. So any send off for any of you? Last words, last thought?
No, appreciate the time, and thank you guys for participating. Thank you to kind of our panelists, Paul, Johnny. Really appreciate the support and the time, and hope to continue kind of working together.
Thanks.
Definitely. Always good seeing you guys. Thank you so much.